Hey everyone, welcome to Hit the Deck. I'm Will, and today I'll be going through my version of a colorless control deck helmed by Liberator, Urza's Battle Thopter. Let's get into it. So, to start things off, I want to go through some of the deck's aims, how it plays, how the deck is designed to win, and the kinds of players that might enjoy playing this kind of deck. So, as I've said, the general plan of this deck is to be a draw go colorless control deck. It's designed to have a reactive game plan, and it's designed to respond to its opponent's threats and then flash in some scary permanents to then kind of essentially launch a counter attack, if you will, and close out the game quite quickly once the board has been controlled and once the deck has kind of got set up enough value engines to carry out its sort of end game phase. So that's kind of the general play pattern of the deck. Another thing that I'm quite excited to talk about is this idea of this deck having what I want to call the perfect land base, the perfect mana base, but it's not really about the mana, right? It's in a general sense, it's about having utility embedded in each of the lands that the deck plays. I've set up a couple of caveats for this that I'm going to go through when we get to that section about the land base and the mana base. But I essentially want as much of the mana base to enter untapped to produce colorless mana because it's a colorless deck, and I want most of the lands to do other things as well. And this does some interesting things to the consistency of the deck, and it kind of makes up for some of the limitations that the colorless identity sets up. Because the astute among you will have noticed I've said I want to play a colorless deck that's reactive, and generally it's not really colorless, I guess, isn't really a color, but that we're getting pedantic at this point. The colorless identity is not great at being reactive. It's not like the color blue, right, which is designed to be a reactive color. It doesn't have reactivity hardwired into its color identity. So that is essentially where Liberator Urza's Battle Thopter comes in. And those of you who know the card, that will make sense. That will kind of contextualize why the commander is helming the deck, why it's in the deck. But yeah, I think it'll be worthwhile to just sort of read through the card, and then we'll sort of. I think the justification is pretty plain to see, but we'll get into that. So Liberator Urza's Battle Thopter is 3 colorless mana for a 1/2 with flash and flying. It reads, you may cast colorless spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. Cool. That's your reactivity. That's where the control-y kind of playing spells on other players' turns comes in. Whenever you cast a spell, if the amount of mana spent to cast that spell is greater than Liberator Urza's Battle Thopter's power, put a +1/+1 counter on Liberator. So the main reason why this card is the commander of the deck is for that first ability. You may cast color spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. So if anyone who doesn't know, that means you can play any colorless spell, which is the whole deck. You can play, or an artifact. There's plenty of artifacts in the deck. But you can play them at instant speed. You can play them on other players' turns, and you can play them in response to spells going on the stack. And while that's not Well, that's not a sort of value accruing ability. It's a very interesting enabler. It's an interesting legendary card. I think it's one of the it's the only instance of a legendary card in colorless that can do this. So it's quite a unique card, and therefore it sort of occupies its own niche and is important to the deck. The second ability is phrased in an interesting way. I think they could have just said whenever you cast a spell, if the mana value of that spell is greater than Liberator's power, put a +1/+1 counter on it. But it says if the amount of mana spent to cast that spell is greater than its power, you do so. So obviously this kind of rules out things like Cascade. Like if you cascade into a 6-drop spell, you cast it for free, so you don't pay any mana for it, so you don't put a +1/+1 counter on Liberator. It just kind of rules out some edge cases of you might have some artifact cost reducers that mean you pay, I don't know, one mana for a commander sphere or something like that, and that because it's been reduced, you don't put a +1/+1 counter. It's kind of just gravy, to be honest. It's sort of just a nice to have. Liberator can grow, and there are, if you quickly look through the deck and go down to the curve, there are sort of 8, 9, 10, 12 mana spells in the deck, and a decent amount of them. So if Liberator sticks around for a while, the commander could be reasonably big. That is something that the deck is sensitive to. But I think it's a really interesting commander. Also, it itself has flash, so you don't have to cast it on your turn and then you have your other colorless spells have flash. You can flash it in and then flash other things in as well, which I think is maybe an interesting way to play the commander, an interesting way to play the deck. Although generally, I quite like to play and we'll see this in the play patterns. I like to play Liberator, flash it out into something else because it sort of generates value straight away, and then you can then use it the immediate turn after the player whose end step you flash the commander in on. And so that's the commander, just with some extra thoughts about how it contributes to the deck's capabilities, how it contributes to the game plan and the play patterns. Something I think that is worth mentioning as well is the things that Liberator as a commander doesn't allow you to do. And looking at the card, like I've said, it's quite an exceptional, not exceptional as in good, but like the exception to the rule. It's not a very frequently seen ability, particularly in this part of the color pie, or lack of it. But there are limitations to having a commander like this in that it doesn't really contribute to much of a value engine. I really like commanders that have card advantage embedded in their design, and Liberator doesn't have this, and that is something that I've had to be quite cognizant of in the building of the deck. Similarly, it doesn't really allow you to ramp in a consistent fashion, although flashing this in and then flashing in Thran Dynamo immediately after feels pretty good. Although that's not inherently built into the card. You have to actually have a ramp piece as well to be able to flash that in. So there's not, as a commander, it allows us to do the cool reactive part of our gameplay, but it doesn't really generate value. So I have had to be quite wary of that when the deck has been put together. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to enable the tags for this deck, so we can essentially go through the stats of the deck and basically have a think about how that is essentially been put in place to make up for some of the limitations that Liberator as a commander puts forward. Okay, so to gain a sense of how the deck leans into Liberator's flash enabling abilities, but also compensates for the value that it could produce, but it doesn't. I'm going to go through the stats of the deck, and I'm going to be using the Command Zones deck building template that was published recently. If you're somehow not aware of that template, go check it out. The video is pretty great. I've watched it like 3 times. It's a really interesting template, and it feels like a real like modernization and update of deck building templates, I think, that have been thrown around in the past. One of the things I like about it is how it makes the removes the distinction between like removing something and just disrupting an opponent's game plan. I'd often have issues classifying my board wipes. I think, oh, like a disrupt decorum goads everyone. So that's everyone. Just goads them all at the table. Everyone's getting really angry. It goads all creatures, right? At least I think that's what it does. Maybe it doesn't. It goads a lot of stuff. And I'd have that down, regardless, I'd have that down as half a board wipe. And when I was sort of adding up the stats for how many board wipes a deck might have, I'd be like, oh, well, there's like 2.5, but not really. And I'm kind of not sure. But the idea of the same thing is true with like removal and counter spells, right? I'd be thinking, oh, okay, there's a Swords to Plowshares in there for sort of dealing with creatures, and then I have some counter spells to deal, to provide board wipe protection, and I would be like, well, is that removal? Is it protection? What's going on there? And that idea of targeted disruption and mass disruption, I just think it's a really astute way of distinguishing between the kinds of cards that players like to play in Commander. So I say I'm using the template. I do go a little bit off track from it because of what the deck's trying to do, but I think it's a really good starting point, and I'm using that as essentially a set of benchmarks. And I am by occupation, I'm a lecturer, so I will cite my sources. The link to the Command Zone deck building template will be in my bio. Not that anyone will really be discovering the Command Zone through me at this point, right? It's way more likely to be that if you're seeing this video, you already know the Command Zone. But I want to cite my sources, so I'm gonna link to them, as if as if they know me, right? Okay, so that aside, the Command Zone template suggests that you should have 12 sources of card advantage, and quite clearly you can see here that I'm above that number in 16. So one of the things I've found when putting together a colorless deck in the past is that it's quite easy to run out of cards. It's quite easy to have a small hand while you're playing your colorless deck. And I think that's for a number of reasons. The first reason is because it's kind of also a strength. And I think it's because colorless decks, they're quite good at ramping, right? A Mind Stone essentially functions as an arcane signet, but with the opportunity to cash it in for a card. Similarly, like a Thran Dynamo gives you 3 colorless mana, and you can generate quite a lot of colorless mana because it's usually like in the design of the card, it's like assumed that colorless mana is a bit of a downside. Like you can use it to help to cast colored spells, but it won't get you all the way there. You need to tap your lands at some point. And that's something I wanted to capitalize on. But what that generally means in terms of card velocity is that you'll play a couple of rocks, you'll play a threat, and you'll have played your lands, and then you're looking at your hand, and there's sort of 1 or 2 cards in hand, and that's not if you want to go for sort of control-y kind of monitoring the board-based strategy, that's not a good place to be. So one of the reasons why colorless decks, I think, tend to move towards having a smaller hand is because of the amount of ramp that they can play, and that they do play to good effect. The other thing is that, with some exceptions, the card draw on offer in the colorless color identity is quite limited, I think, and like there are obvious exceptions, right? The One Ring being a really good example of this, and I think card draw in the colorless identity is weird calling it identity when it's not there. I suppose that's still identity. We're not going to get into the ins and outs of like what is identity in this video, but there are examples of colorless cards that draw cards effectively. So like a skull clamp, which I'm going to get into in a little bit because it's an interesting include in this deck. But certainly the One Ring, the ability for colorless cards to accrue card advantage, is something that I think is on the rise. And with this deck being a control deck, it does play a good amount of card advantage. There's quite a high number here in terms of card advantage, and the reason that this is quite high is because a good chunk, I think, of this, what I'm going to term as card advantage, is quite high up in the curve, right? So, for instance, the COLOURLESS, right? These two COLOURLESS, the Broken Reality can draw up to 4 cards, but it's 9 mana. The Great Distortion can completely refill your hand if you've sort of dwindled down to, well, less than 7 cards. But it's at 10 mana. So the card advantage in this build is kind of distributed pretty much all the way along the curve, which, I think in a deck that isn't colorless and can't make a lot of mana, this deck does make a lot of mana. We'll get into that in a sec. But I've found this to be okay, but the deck does really kind of hope that it grabs a Zenith Chronicler or a Mask of Memory or one of the sort of cheaper card advantage spells to sort of keep that keep a full grip, essentially. And that's the reason why we've gone over the template, right? Because some of it's quite expensive, and if you're able to ramp into it on turn 4, 5, 6, amazing, but that's not necessarily the case, so we have a lot of it. And similarly, there's a lot of card selection. And this is one of the reasons there's a lot of card selection, is because there's quite a few lands in the deck that draw cards. And I think that's so important because it's similar to that thing that MDFCs are really good at, in that they are spells and lands. That it kind of is like flood insurance, flood prevention. So even if you draw like a 5-land hand, right, for instance, one of them's a Fountain Port and one of them's a Bonder's Enclave, right, and you still have ways to draw cards, but they are embedded in your land base, which is kind of, more on this in a sec. Maybe more than a sec. More on this later. But that was one of the things that I wanted for this land base. I wanted it to have multiple functionality, but also have the potential opportunity for drawing into more cards and having lands that really sort of do something for the deck. So, the Gaia Reach Sanitarium, the Bond's Enclave, War Room is a really good example of this, because it's 3 pay life equal to the number of colors in your commander's color identity, draw a card. That's something I really like about this deck. There's no colors in Liberator's color identity, so you don't have to pay any life for War Room. I think that's a really neat synergy, and that is you know, a kind of a really good example of what I what I like, the way that the card selection can be integrated into a deck. So it has high numbers, right? 31 total cards that either, you know, that either give advantage and or selection. In a, you can think of that in a more general sense as, you know, 31 cards that say draw a card in some capacity on them. Like, you know, Zuladoc says Cascade. You're basically getting a card and you're getting a bit of ramp as well. But I've been quite sort of permissive with what constitutes to card advantage. But if it gets you up a card, it's in the category. And I think that is, you know, a reasonable way to categorize the way the deck generates value in terms of seeing more cards. I'd also say as well, like just going back to the point that that some of the card draw is quite expensive. Colorless decks are quite good at ramping. In testing, this deck has sort of, in quite a number of occasions, right? It's sort of had 7 or 8 mana on turns 4 and 5. Like it really can ramp quite effectively, and we'll get onto that now. And one of the reasons that it can ramp quite effectively is because we have 36 instances of cards that ramp into other cards in some way. To put that into perspective, the command zone template says you should have between 10 and 12 of these. So that's nearly 3 times what the template suggests. So, you know, you could say that I've just kind of completely bastardized the template and I'm just ignoring it. Yeah, I guess so. It's a template. That's kind of the fun of doing so. And the reason why this number is so high is partly because of the Landbase that I've been discussing. So we'll get back to playing a Nexus in a min, but I've also sort of classed like Eugene's Labyrinth and Urza's Workshop, Urza's Saga as ramp cards because, you know, Urza's Saga, you're usually going to grab the Soul Ring, which feels rampy to me, right? And you know, there's a lot of ramp cards here, but the reason why this number can be so high, and I think it's one of the most important messages from that command zone deck building template video, is you can have overlap. And what having essentially a land base of utility lands like a Deserted Temple and Eldrazi Temple and things like that, what that can give you is loads of overlap, because it means that pretty much all of your lands do something else as well as being lands, like Shrine of the Forsaken Gods. I've got this down as ramp. Yeah, it only kicks in if you have 7 or more lands, but you know, this deck can ramp pretty well. You know, it plays sort of Solemn Simulacrum. It doesn't play loads, I guess, sort of the Animist. I'm just thinking of the land-based ramp that it does play. It's mainly artifact-based, but it can really, you know, it can meet, quite often it can meet the caveats that a lot of these lands put on their ramping capabilities, just to sort of make sure the lands aren't insanely broken. Like Gaia's Cradle, for instance. Eugene's Labyrinth, you have to have a mana value 7 or higher spell in your hand to exile with it. So there are, you know, but the deck can do that, right? That's kind of one of the things I find really interesting about it. So there's loads of overlap. There's loads of, and for that reason, there's loads of redundancy in terms of what ramp can be on offer. You know, there's quite a few instances of ramp cards that do other things as well, like a Forsaken Monument, or, you know, Rise of the Eldrazi. If you cast in Rise of the Eldrazi, you're doing pretty well in the game. So in terms of, I'm going to go back to Mass Disruption. There's 12 Mass Disruption, which is again double. I like the template, but yeah, I feel like as I'm going through this with you guys, I feel like I've clearly just been like, it's just a guide. Like, let's just triple it, let's double it, let's see how we go. But there is a reason for having so much Mass Disruption as well, and that is the limited colorless access to viable counter spells. I suppose, you know, you don't have that that option that you have in blue where you can just be like, right, I'll hold mana and, you know, a counter spell will save me from one thing in this turn cycle. That's not really how a reactive colorless deck can solve that issue. And instead, what I've found is a sort of viable alternative, I guess, is more kind of like 3-for-1 or 4-for-1 style removal spells, or just a number of effective, I say effective, one-sided board wipes, I think it's probably fair to say. A number of board wipes that leave you in a better tactical position than your opponents. So that's why there's 12 of them here. All is Dust is, you know, probably the best example of this. Just sacrifice all coloured permanents that are in play, essentially. And we'll come back to that, but that's how this deck aims to control the board. It kind of doesn't really have a way of answering, you know, a board wipe. It doesn't really have a way of, you know, just straightforwardly countering it that blue has, for instance. So it really tries to sort of slow things down and make sure things don't get out of hand, and then just have more mana than the rest of the table, and, you know, be able to sort of get into some of the powerful cards that are already on screen in the most opportune moment, right? So that's why it plays a lot of Mass Disruption. I'm still testing the amount of Mass Disruption. This has felt okay. A lot of it's quite expensive, as you can see. And a lot of it seems quite expensive, as you can see, and that's kind of by design, right? I'll often find that an All Is Dust or a Calamity of the Titans comes after as a counter to a setback of my own, right? And that is something that, you know, you have to be quite careful of in terms of balancing, because, you know, I think the one that would be perhaps most likely to be swapped out is Calamity of the Titans, because obviously it exiles each creature and planeswalker with mana value less than the reveal card's mana value. With a 3 mana commander, this tends to hit your commander. So this is kind of really only good when you've had a setback or you're kind of behind, and you do need a big colorless creature card in your hand for it to be effective. So I've kind of found this to be not always what I want it to be in testing, but its capacity to control the board and get rid of problematic creatures forever has been something I've found myself also quite happy with at certain times. So that's the Mass Disruption. The targeted disruption is is about right. It's just about on track in terms of the deck building template that I've loosely used, that I've thought about while I've been putting the deck together, right? So your targeted disruption, the deck building template that the Command Zone have put together suggests sort of 12, right? So 13 is a bit above that. One of the things that I've really looked for in the targeted disruption category is I've wanted removal, to coin older turn of phrase, that is flexible, right? And I mean that in terms of it hitting a variety of permanents, so like a Eugene the Ineffable, but also multifunctional. So a lot of the targeted disruption that I've looked to include also does other things as well. Kozilek's Command is a really good example of this. Eugene the Ineffable is a good example of this. And Endbringer is a bit of a pet card. I just think it's really cool. He's got loads of legs, and he's like doing a kind of like Jujutsu Kaisen kind of like hand symbol. I just think it's neat. Um, so that's some targeted disruption. It's quite expensive. It answers a lot of things, but it also does some other things as well. That's been kind of what I've been looking for that. And that is essentially the stats rundown. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back through these categories, and I'm going to outline some paradigms for the kinds of card advantage I really kind of feel happy with playing in this deck. I'm going to look at the kind of benchmark, the kinds of targeted disruption that play out effectively in the deck. So I'm going to go through that, and I'm going to highlight some paradigmatic examples, the version of card advantage that you're most happy to see. And I'm going to go through that right now. Let's get into the archetypal card advantage that we want for this deck. So first and foremost, I'm going to draw your attention to Mask of Memory. This is 2 mana for an artifact equipment spell. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you may draw 2 cards. If you do, discard a card, and it equips for 1. So Mask of Memory is, okay, it's quite a generic card draw spell. It does rely on having creatures in play, but I wanted to draw your attention to it for a couple of reasons. First of all is its capacity to be repeatable card advantage, and therefore addressing that issue that colorless decks can sometimes have, where your hand size is kind of dwindling, because you can quite consistently get in an attack. We'll get into that in a sec. But you can get damage through, you draw 2 cards, and you sort of throw away the one that you need the least. One of the reasons that I've highlighted Mask of Memory is because Liberator has flying. So from that, we can probably assume that we'll have at least one decent attack, right? There's a pretty good chance that one of our opponents doesn't have a flyer. So that could be sort of I imagine it'll probably be turn 4. Let's think through the play pattern, shall we? So turn 2, you play a Mask of Memory. Turn 3, say you pass the turn, you flash in Liberator on your the player before you use end step, and for 3 mana, and then you play your land on turn 4. You have 4 mana in play. You can pay the 1 then to equip Mask of Memory to Liberator and attack straight away. You could even flash in a 2 or 3 drop after the attack to get in that 1 more point of damage by putting a +1/+1 counter on Liberator. So that's one of that play pattern for this deck is one of the reasons why I think Mask of Memory is a good include. It's one of the cheaper sources of card draw in the deck, and it's just pretty well aligned to what the commander can do, right? Its ability to fly and get in and have, functional haste is what I think I'm going to sort of call it in this video. That functional haste of you can flash it in at the end of the prior opponent's end step and attack, equip it for 1 and attack straight away. It plays better than maybe the card does in other decks, or maybe than it reads, and it's just a really kind of useful source of card draw. And it does let you discard a card, which will be important when we start talking about the mass disruption cards in the next segment. Similarly to Mask of Memory, I want to draw your attention to the Aether Spark. Now, this is quite a new card, so I haven't had loads of opportunities to test it out. But as a colorless source of card draw and ramp, I think it's a pretty good shout, I think, in this deck. Let's read through the card. The Aether Spark is a 4 colorless mana legendary artifact planeswalker equipment. I think that's fun, right? Like they didn't have to template the types that way, but I I enjoyed it. I think I'm biased because I just think the card's really cool. Anyway, let's read through the rest of the card before we get into evaluation to greater an extent. As long as the Aether Spark is attached to a creature, the Aether Spark can't be attacked and has whenever equipped creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters on the Aether Spark. I'm not sure why it says deals combat damage during your turn. It'd be difficult to, deal combat damage on someone else's turn. I don't understand that. Anyway, so what that means is it means when it's equipped, you essentially it's not a planeswalker that you can attack. Well, your opponents can't attack it. And when the equipped creature deals damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters on the Aether Spark. So let's think about it. If you have Liberator out on turn 3, turn 4, you play your land, you tap for colorless mana, you play the Aether Spark. Sorry, I haven't finished reading it. I'm just used to going through the play patterns. Let's go through the abilities of the Aether Spark. You can +1 it to attach Aether Spark to up to one target creature you control. Put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. So it's up to one target creature, so you don't have to equip it to something. But given that there's no other way to equip it to anything, and when it's equipped to a creature, it can't be attacked, probably in your interest to do so. So you +1 it to 5, and the Aether Spark, when it puts a +1/+1 counter on the creature it's attached to. You can -5 it to draw 2 cards. That's why it's in the card advantage category. I think it's a pretty good, a reasonably consistent source of card advantage in that sense. And you can -10 it to add 10 mana of any one color. So yeah, a really sort of splashy -10 there. Let's go through the play pattern that I was really excited to apparently go into previously. So turn 3, we've played Liberator for 3 mana, maybe on the end step because we want to be a bit flashy with this one, guys, right? And then you play your land, you play 4 mana for the Aether Spark, and you can only +1 it, right? We can't -5 the Aether Spark straight away. So you +1 it, you go to 5 loyalty on the Aether Spark, and you put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. So when you cast the Aether Spark, if you pay 4 mana for it, Liberator will be a 2/3 because it's put 1 counter on it. Then when you equip the Aether Spark, it becomes a 3/4, obviously with flying. Just want to reiterate that because that's how it will hopefully deal combat damage. It becomes a 3/4. So then on turn 4, when you played the Aether Spark, you get 1 counter from Liberator's innate ability, you get 1 counter from equipping the Aether Spark. So it's a 3/3, it's a 3/4 with flying, and then when you attack, I keep scrolling past it, there we go. When this creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters on the Aether Spark. So it's on 5 when it's equipped to Liberator. You fly in and hit for 3. It then goes to 8. So that's the kind of the earliest optimum window to play Aether Spark in relation, and to equip it to your commander. And by the end of turn 4, it will have 8 loyalty counters on it. So what I think that means in practice is it will probably be the turn after that you get your 2 cards back. And but equally, if you attack again, you could essentially activate the Aether Spark in your second main on the 5th turn, right? You could attack again. So it would be on 8 at the beginning of your 5th turn, and then when you hit again, you'll hit for another 3, assuming you haven't cast something else, and you could be well into sort of 11, 12 loyalty on the Aether Spark by turn 5 if you equip it to Liberator and attack with it straight away, essentially, which means you could feasibly you could draw the cards if you need them, but you could also have the option within two. The first turn you hit in and go to 8. The second turn you hit in and go to 11. So you could, in the second turn of having the Aether Spark, activate that -10, which I think is really cool. And I know we're not talking about ramp here. It's here for the card advantage. But even if you were at, let's say you go up to 11 at the conservative estimate. Say you haven't cast anything on turn 5 before you attack with Liberator, equipped with Aether Spark for the second time. You -5 the Aether Spark, and you still have 6 loyalty on it, which it's you could do that again if you're able to sort of protect your commander effectively, and drawing the cards would enable you to have a better chance of doing so. So I wanted to talk about the Aether Spark as kind of like Mask of Memories, like Big Brother, right? These kind of card draw spells that in some decks aren't that good, right? Because they have to have a creature in play, but because you have an evasive creature in Liberator, these card advantage spells can really lean into that quality of the commander, and I thought it was worth talking about. Obviously, we've got the One Ring in here. This makes the deck a bracket 3. It's obviously it's a game changer, which is indicated there. We know it's a good card, right? It's 4 mana for a legendary artifact with indestructible. When the One Ring enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you gain protection from everything until your next turn. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life for each bird encounter on the One Ring. And you can tap it to put a bird encounter on the One Ring, then draw a card for each bird encounter on the One Ring. So it's a really, really powerful source of card advantage. That is just, I think it's the best card draw spell. Certainly in colorless, it's one of the best generally. I don't even think that's really much of. I think you'd be a bit. You'd be quite out there if you were if you were contending that point, I think. So it's in the deck because it's a really good source of card advantage. This is supposed to be a control deck. When you have the One Ring in your hand or in play, you feel quite happy. The deck feels like it's doing what it needs to do. Also, I think one of the things that's quite interesting is if you are able to flash in the One Ring, you can. So when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you gain protection from everything until your next turn. If you draw it late in the game and someone kind of thinks that they've got you dead on board, and they sort of make that lethal attack, and you're able to flash in the One Ring, and they had no way of. I mean, they'd see you'd have open mana, right? But they'd have no way of seeing that you have something that specifically says you gain protection from everything until your next turn. You can use the One Ring to get out of some tricky situations towards the end of the game, and then in the sort of early, in inverted commas, and mid-game, it's just a really good source of card advantage. So that's why it's in here. Skullclamp is one that I wanted to mention quickly. Obviously a very good colorless card draw spell. However, it is one that I'm pondering. It is one of the, I don't want to say, one of the lesser justified Skullclamp includes that I've done, that I've put into decks in my time. Given the fact there's not loads of 1 toughness creatures in the deck. So Zenith Chronicler is one. There are there was a couple more that I wanted to mention. I think Mere Convert was one of them. There's not loads of them. I included a Hangerback Walker, which is probably the best synergy for it, right? You play a really big Hangerback Walker, find a way to kill it. You could flash it out and have it die in combat. That's quite a good way to activate dice triggers in this deck. You could have the Hangerback Walker die and then copy it with Abstruse Archaic, which copies activated or triggered abilities from colorless sources. And you could make a lot of what are they? They're Thopters. Yeah, Thopter artifact creature tokens, and then you'd be quite set up with the Skullclamp. That said, a lot of the utility creatures in this deck are kind of more like, like Scrawling Crawler, or two toughness things, Solemn Simulacrum. So yeah, Skullcamp is a very good source of card advantage, but it's not. It's here because it's a good colorless source of card advantage, as opposed to this. It's here because Skullcamp is a really good source of colorless card advantage, as opposed to this deck being able to make like loads of little expendable tokens to sort of sacrifice the Skullcamp, well, to equip the Skullcamp and generate value. That said, there is another layer of justification that essentially relates to the land base in the deck, and this idea that I've sort of pitched a couple of times of having a very functional land base and having lands that do a lot of different things. And as an extension to that, running as many specific land tutors that I can to be able to access that kind of toolboxy, the toolboxy land base, right? So with, say you have a Skullcamp in hand, right? Just to sort of go through, anyone who's not aware, Skullcamp is 1 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/-1. Whenever a equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards, and it equips for 1. So that's Skullcamp. I'm sure most people knew that, but just in case you didn't, there we go. Some of the lands that I've included, if we have a Skullcamp and a expedition map, for instance, in our opening hand, a really good kind of way to work Skullcamp into the strategy, even though we don't play loads of 1 toughness creatures, is we essentially can tutor for a land that generates 1/1 tokens. Fountain Port is a good example of this. You can tap it for colorless. It's an untapped source, so it ticks all the boxes for what the lands of this deck require. And you have the option to tap 3, tap Fountain Port, so 4 mana total, pay 1 life to create a 1/1 blue fish creature token. Wonderful. You make a fish, and then you have the Skullclamp eat the fish. You draw 2 cards. So that's on a land. So it's quite unlikely that opponents are going to be able to deal with this. And although it costs, like, I suppose it's 5 mana total, isn't it? 4 to make the fish, and then 1 to equip it to get 2. But if that's kind of repeatable, and the deck does generate a lot of colorless mana, so you maybe feel that 5 mana. Admittedly, you can make it the token at instant speed, but you have to equip and kill it with the Skullclamp on your turn, obviously, because it's an equip cost and they can only be activated at sorcery speed. But we have another example of this. Let me just see if I can find it. In the Mirex, essentially. Why can't I find the Mirex? Have I not tagged it? Yeah, I haven't tagged the Mirex. But this is an untapped colorless land that can tap for any color, only if it entered this turn. We don't care about that because we want colorless mana. And you can pay 3, tap it to create a 1/1 Phyrexian Might. That's another thing that you can essentially tutor up with your toolboxy land base in order to get your Skullclamp a bit more online. So on one hand, although the deck doesn't run loads of 1 toughness creatures, and maybe Skullclamp is a bit more of a dubious include than it should be, given that it's Skullclamp and it's just a really good card. There are ways that I've looked to address this and worked into the land base and the ways for tutoring for it. Similarly, there's quite a few ways to tutor for Skullcamp as well, to sort of make that combination in Inventor's Fair and Urza Saga also. So they're just some examples of archetypal but also interesting card draw. Interesting in the sense that it does what the deck's wanting to do, and it sort of synergizes well with the commander and so on. So that's some examples of the kind of archetypal card advantage that we want in the deck. Let's move on to the archetypal mass disruption. I'm going to skip over card selection because I'm going to talk about card selection a little bit more when it comes to what the land base is. But for now, that's how we want to get card advantage. And let's go on to mass disruption. Okay, so the archetypal mass disruption category is what we're going to go through next. And I wanted to draw your attention first and foremost straightforwardly to what All Is Dust can do in this deck. So All Is Dust is a 7-mana typal sorcery Eldrazi, so it counts as an Eldrazi in terms of its creature, well, its sorcery types, I guess. Each player sacrifices all colored permanents that they control. So this is kind of the best board wipe in the deck, right? It hits all permanents. Notably, lands are technically not colored permanents, so it doesn't just nuke everyone's lands. But what it does do is it hits enchantments, it hits artifacts, it hits planeswalkers, it hits the lot of them. If they've got color on the card, it hits them. This is just an obviously good card in this deck. It's not really particularly profound of me to note that. However, what I am going to do is let's do a little thought experiment, shall we? Let's imagine that this was a typal instant. Yeah, because that's that was a bit smug of me, wasn't it? Sorry about that. That's what Liberator lets us do, right? You can cast colorless spells and artifacts as though they have flash. It's not an artifact, but it is a spell, and you can cast this at instant speed. So I thought the experiment, so following on from that experiment, a typal instant, All Is Dust. Let's compare this to what is generally considered one of the best one-sided board wipes in the format, Cyclonic Rift. Now, Cyclonic Rift is a very, very, very good card. It's a one-sided non-land permanent bounce effect at instant speed. The thing that I think, if All Is Dust is a typal instant, the thing that I think that Cyclonic Rift has on this card is that it does have the mode to be activated for 2 mana in case you really just need to like disrupt someone's combo or get a big attacker off the board. It does have a little bit more modality in that sense, in that, you know, it's ultimately a 2 mana card, right? And it has the option to overload it. That optionality is maybe what you know, you could make the case for instant speed All Is Dust not being as modal as Cyclonic Rift. However, when we think of All Is Dust in a colorless deck, and when we think of All Is Dust at the end of the previous player's end step, I think that's where the comparison gets quite interesting. So this is let's compare it to the overloaded version that bounces all opponents' non-land permanents. So it hits all non-land permanents. So does it hits being Cyclonic Rift. So does All Is Dust. So doing both of them, you can fire them off at the previous player's end step, and you essentially get the chance to untap and rebuild first. That's the advantage to having an instant speed board wipe. That's why it's a strong and powerful thing to do. The differences that between an instant speed All Is Dust and Cyclonic Rift that are of note are the Cyclonic Rift bounces the non-land permanents to hand, whereas All Is Dust makes the player sacrifice them, right? So All Is Dust instant speed and for all opponents makes them sacrifice all colored permanents they control, whereas Cyclonic Rift is just a bounce. I mean, you know how a Cyc Rift plays out, they often have to discard to hand size, and it does get rid of some stuff. But All Is Dust gets around indestructible. It means that you know the players can't replay cheaper non-land permanents. So it's just a lot more of a final answer to everyone's stuff, all your opponent's stuff at instant speed, and you can rebuild straight away. That's my case for it. This feels, if you can play an instant speed All Is Dust, it feels really broken, and it's just a really good include in the deck. It's kind of an obvious one, but I just wanted to run through that little experiment with you guys. Eugen the Spirit Dragon is probably, for its -X, is a similar case, right? It says exile each permanent with converted mana cost X or less that's one or more colors. So it's a similar effect for one more mana. But the thing is you can't activate this ability at instant speed. So you would have to flash it in, nothing happens, then activate it, and then I suppose functionally it's still a similar sort of thing. So you kind of have two you have a bit of redundancy of this effect. Although I would say All Is Dust is a bit more, it's more efficient. I suppose exiling each one is a little bit more final. They're both really excellent one-sided board wipes that really disrupt your opponents and don't do anything. It doesn't affect your board at all. So they're really sort of powerful disruption spells, really good at controlling the board. And they're kind of win cons in a way, right? I don't know how many of you guys have seen. I mean, I've seen loads of games just won by a Ruinous Ultimatum and then swing in, and then the power balance in the game is so off that it's just kind of a bit of a formality at that stage. But yeah, certainly at instant speed, these cards are a force to be reckoned with. I did want to talk about some of the more reserved versions of this effect, right? What I said earlier on was this sort of 2, 3, 4 for 1 removal at instant speed that kind of gets a bit better. The first thing I wanted to mention was Desecrate Reality. This is an instant. This is I think this is one of the few really good colorless instants that doesn't need it doesn't need Liberator to be in play, so it's quite good if Liberator does sort of get taxed out of the game and killed and people are really going for Liberator. Desecrate Reality is still something you can do as part of your sort of reactive game plan. It reads, Desecrate Reality, 7 mana for an instant. For each opponent, exile up to 1 target permanent that player controls with an even mana value. So 0 is even, and it says target permanent, so it could be a land, right? This hits lands at instant speed, so it can be really disruptive. It's why it's on the list. And it also has Adamant. If at least 3 colorless mana, I mean, obviously, it's a colorless deck, was spent to cast a spell, return a permanent card with an odd mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. So it's also a recursion spell, right? That's maybe one of the areas that the deck doesn't do lots of doesn't take lots of actions in terms of recursion. So this could be getting you back a really important piece that maybe you thought you'd lost forever. It might be everything seems to be even while I'm looking at it. It might be that it gets you back a Kozilek Broken Reality, right? It's a cast spell, but it still has the overrun. Anyway, so I thought that was a kind of like 3 for 1, very, very versatile 3 for 1 removal spell with a bit of extra gravy on top. I also wanted to outline Selective Obliteration, which is 3 and 2 colorless for a sorcery, which reads each player chooses a color, then exile each permanent unless it's colorless or it's only the color its controller chose. So first and foremost, it doesn't hit any of your colorless stuff. And it hits permanents as well. It hits it doesn't just hit creatures, it hits a whole range of different card types, which is what we want from the removal in the deck. And the way this works is basically if you're playing against a monocolored deck, they're kind of fine. They sort of survive the obliteration. Like the obliteration just shoots over their head and they're okay. But if they're playing, I don't know, like a 3 or 4 colored deck and they have permanents of a range of different colors, they can choose to save things of one color. So I don't know, say you're playing Izzet, for instance, and you have like a Niv Mizzet out and, I don't know, a Gutter Snipe. Yeah, pretty scary. You would have to, you would basically, actually, you could just choose red, couldn't you? No, you couldn't. So unless it's only the color. So yeah, it hits multicolored things, right? Unless it's colorless or it's only the color its controller chose. So if they'd have to choose red to keep the Gutter Snipe, but because Niv Mizzet is red and blue, that would get exiled. I believe that's how Selective Obliteration works. yeah, if that's not the case, let me know. But I've found that it usually hits two or three things, and they can be like non-creatures. They can be multicolored permanents, like a team or ascendancy just has no chance, right? And what I was going to say is, again, if we imagine this at instant speed at the beginning of someone's end step, it doesn't hit any of your stuff, and it can really disrupt the board. That's the kind of thing we are looking at. The last thing I wanted to mention was, again, going at this, keeping in mind this kind of 3 or 4 for 1 tendency towards mass disruptions. COLOURLESS command. This is X and 2 colorless for a kindred instant Eldrazi, and you can choose 2. Target player creates X 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens with sacrifice this creature, add colorless. Target player scries X, then draws a card. Exile target creature with mana value X or less, or you can exile up to X cards from target graveyards. So this is one of the better sources of graveyard hate in the deck. That's important. You can play it for X, where X equals 3 and get the best 3 things out of someone's graveyard, and then I don't know, maybe you make the 3 Eldrazi spawn tokens because you want to clamp them with Skull Clamp potentially. Maybe you just want a bit of a rebate on the mana, but this is a really sort of really kind of a nice modal spell. I really like modal spells in control decks. It's why I've also got Eldrazi Complements in here. Just being able to deal with a range of different situations is really important for the deck. So that is all of the mass disruption I wanted to talk about. Actually, no, it's not. I wanted to mention Emrakul the World Anew. So Emrakul the World Anew is a 12 mana legendary creature Eldrazi. When you cast this spell, gain control of all creatures target player controls. Flying, protection from spells and from permanents that were cast this turn. When Emrakul the World Anew leaves the battlefield, sacrifice all creatures you control. Madness, pay 6 colorless mana. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is it's clearly mass disruption. You can take someone's all of the creatures from someone's board and just hang on to them. You can just say, welcome to my space, guys. We're here, we're having a good time, and you're mine now. But I wanted to draw your attention to the madness part of this spell. A lot of colorless spells, including Mask of Memory that I've already spoken about, include some sort of discard clause, right? I noted Smuggler's Copter does this, Gaia Reach Sanitarium does this, Kozilek can do that. So there's quite a few. Currency Converters are really good one for that as well. Draw a card and discard a card. These loot effects. There's quite a few of them in the colorless deck, in a colorless control deck, because we want to keep on being able to hit the important pieces for our strategy, and actually we can turn those discard outlets into a bit of a shot at a bit of an advantage, right? It's not always going to be the case that you have this card in hand when you have to discard something, but at least when it does happen, you have the possibility to play this in for 6 and really, really disrupt someone's board. So I just wanted to sort of point that interaction out. And with that, we will move on to talking about the ramp in the deck. I feel like it's pretty insane that I haven't spoken about this card yet, but it was essentially the card that inspired the construction of the deck, and it's the archetypal piece of ramp that I want to draw your attention to, and that is, let me just find it. There's a lot to look through. I want to make sure you can. There we go. That is Darksteel Monolith, right? So Darksteel Monolith reads, it's 8 colorless, 8 generic mana for an artifact with indestructible. Once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a colorless spell you cast from your hand. So it cares about colorless spells, and it cares about playing spells on each player's turn, essentially. Once each turn, not your turn, once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a colorless spell from your hand. So if you have this out and you don't have a flash enabler, it's one, I assume big, because you're going to play the most expensive thing, right, to get the most value out of it. You play one large colorless spell on your turn, and then 3 players have their go, and it's back to you, and you get to do another one. However, if you have Liberator out and you have Flash enabled, once each turn you may pay 0. So you essentially, going around the table, you may play something for 0 on your turn rather than paying its mana cost. Then player 1 goes and you can flash something out for free on their turn. Player 2 goes, you can do the same for their turn, and player 3 goes, you can do the same for their turn. So you get 4 activations of this per turn cycle. And the amount, I mean, it's an expensive card in the first place. It's a decent upfront cost. The deck can deal with that. It's designed to deal with that. It has 35, 36 pieces of ramp in the deck. But you're essentially, your rebate on that is 4 free colorless spells per turn cycle. And that just gets really, really insane if you are paying 0 to cascade into another 2 things, or you are, and we'll talk about this card a little bit more later, you are, where have you gone? Doubling the cast triggers or the permanence with Echoes of Eternity. So this was, this is kind of the card that I was like, I need the perfect home for Darksteel Monolith. It's such an interesting card, and it can be set. It has indestructible for some reason. It's difficult to get rid of, and I just thought this was a really interesting card. The amount of value and advantage you get from it can, if it's played in the way that I just suggested and laid out, can be really quite insurmountable. So. Also you can if you have Echoes of Eternity out first. I'm going to read through this card because I'm going to mention it a couple of times. Echoes of Eternity is 3 and 3 colorless for a Kindred enchantment Eldrazi. If a triggered ability of a colorless spell you control or another colorless permanent you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. And it also reads, whenever you cast a colorless spell, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. A copy of a permanent spell becomes a token. So whenever you cast something that's colorless, you get 2 of it. So whenever you put a spell onto the stack, it copies that spell on the stack. So you would get 2 instances of selective obliteration if you were copying that colorless spell. Similarly, if a triggered ability of a colorless spell you control or another permanent you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So just like active, like ETBs can be doubled up with that first part of the ability. But what I'm interested in here in terms of relating this to Darksteel Monolith is if you have Echoes of Eternity out and you cast the Darksteel Monolith, when you cast the Darksteel Monolith, that counts as casting a colorless spell and you copy it. And it is a permanent spell, so you get a token copy of this. And when you have a Darksteel Monolith and a token copy of that, once each turn you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a colorless spell you cast from your hand. You get 2 instances of that per turn, which is incredible. You'll probably get to a point where you run out of cards with in this situation, but that's why it's really important to have, I was saying earlier about having card advantage sources kind of importantly at the start of the curve, but also further into the curve as well. So it's really good to get the One Ring, for instance, from this, so you can keep drawing into more cards and give you access to more cards later down the line. Similarly, Conduit of Ruin is a really good one because it grabs something else with something 7 or greater, so you're saving 7 or more mana when you cast through Darksteel Monolith if Conduit of Ruin is, tutoring for a good target for that. So some nice synergies there in terms of ramp. This isn't really what I would think of if I saw a ramp card, but it just gives you, admittedly later in the game, but it just gives you so much extra mana's worth of cards that I thought it was worth including in terms of ramp. A really good ramp piece that you know, when it's played, can easily give the deck access to 9 or 10 mana on turns 5 or 6, maybe more, is Forsaken Monument, which is 5 mana for a legendary artifact. Colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. That is no joke. That is a really good static ability. It also has, whenever you tap a permanent for colorless, add an additional colorless. So it's doubling, or certainly adding, in most cases doubling, but certainly adding a colorless pip of mana production to what your cards can produce. And then whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. So a little bit of incremental life gain, which I always have found adds up more, because you're tapping permanents for additional colorless mana, which means that you are able to cast a lot more colorless things. So actually, sometimes this card can come down if you cast it with a Thran Dynamo and a Soul Ring. Let's just say you're having the best time ever, right? You're having a good time. Your opponents aren't. But you know, you're able to then tap all of your lands for additional colorless, and you can sort of cast 3, 4, 5 spells with this and just gain 4 to 8 life the turn it comes down. Really, really good colors card. Not really blowing anyone's mind with this focus. It's obviously a good card for a colorless deck, but I just wanted to talk about it in terms of like a more kind of generic ramp source. And yeah, there are more ways that the deck can ramp that I'm going to talk about when we get onto the Landbase, which I've still got to sort of get to. One thing I did want to note was the Sword of Feast and Famine. Whenever a quick creature deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card and you untap all lands you control. This is a really cool source of ramp in the deck, particularly when you can double it with either Echoes of Eternity, because this counts as the Sword of Feast and Famine trigger counts as a triggered ability of a colorless spell, a colorless permanent you control. So that will get you 2 instances of untapping. And what you can do is, when you untap the first time, you can, with Liberator out, you can at instant speed spend all the mana from the lands that you have on by flashing colorless spells in, and then you can go to the copy of the Sword and Feast and Famine trigger, and they will untap again, and you can just carry on your game plan as it is. Imagine you have Forsaken Monument out, where each land taps for an additional colorless, and you can see the potential for mana generation that this deck has, and it's good at ramping early, and it's good at ramping late. It just really kind of feels like a very strong ramp deck in terms of some of the synergies that we've got going on here. Similarly, with the Sword of Feast and Famine trigger, you could also copy that with an Abstruse Archaic activation. So you can pay 1, tap it to copy target activated or triggered ability you control from a colorless source. So the Sword of Feast and Famine there counts as a colorless source, and you can get those 2 untap triggers, and at instant speed you can use it'll be the copy that will resolve first, right? So you can use the copied untap at instant speed, and then you get the actual untap, and you can, you know, sort of respond to that in your main phase. You can do it whenever you want if Liberator's out, but I just think that's some really cool and interesting ramp synergies. And I'm going to another thing with Abstruse Archaic that I might come back to is that it says from a colorless source, so it can copy things that lands are doing. So this is a further kind of augmentation to the toolboxy land package that the deck puts together. You know, you could pay 1, tap it to copy an activation of, let me just find a land that would be worth copying, an Urza's Saga trigger, right? I think that would be really cool. So you could get your Soul Ring and your Skull Clamp, essentially. You could make 2 constructs, exactly. But we'll talk about the lands later. I don't want to get into that too much now. There's some really interesting ramp interactions that the deck's able to carry out. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about targeted disruption. Okay, so the archetypal targeted disruption that the deck is looking to include, I think can be summed up reasonably well by Urza the Ineffable, which is 6 mana for a legendary planeswalker. That reads colorless spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. So that's a really kind of impressive discount on colorless spells. Yeah, the spell itself is 6 mana, but as we've kind of, as I think I've kind of proved in terms of looking at some of the interactions, this deck does make a lot of colorless mana. So in terms of the actual disruptive aspect of the card, the first +1 ability reads, exile the top card of your library face down and look at it. Create a 2/2 colorless spirit creature token. When that token leaves the battlefield, put the exile card into your hand. And -3 is the disruptive part. It says -3, destroy target permanent that's one or more colors, and Urza the Ineffable enters with 4 loyalty counters. So 6 mana comes down, casts something that was 2 mana for free, -3 it to destroy a problematic permanent. It's doing a lot of things, and it's kind of ticking all of the boxes that I sort of set up as key parameters for what the disruption needs to do here, right? It's ramping you, it's giving you discount on all your spells, but it can certainly mean that a Mind Stone can come down for free, and that can be a nice little bit, a nice sort of bit of gravy on top of the card's effect there. And it's also quite flexible in that you can destroy target permanent that's one or more colors. So it hits enchantments, it hits creatures, it hits planeswalkers, right? I think in terms of lore, that's probably what he meant, what he's supposed to do. I don't know much about lore. I just get the sense that he wants to kill planeswalkers. He's giving that kind of vibe in the art for sure. But this is the kind of archetypal removal the deck wants. It's kind of expensive, but the deck can make a lot of mana. It's flexible in terms of it can solve a lot of problems. It can hit a lot of permanent types, and it also does other things as well. Like it has other functionality. It has a range of effects. So that's the first kind of archetypal form of disruption I wanted to point to. And also Endbringer, right? Endbringer is 5 and a colorless for a creature Eldrazi. Untap Endbringer during each other player's untap step, and you can tap it to deal 1 damage to any target. You can pay 1 colorless and tap it to ensure a creature can't attack or block this turn, and you can pay 2 colorless and tap it to draw a card. So the thing that I really like about this card is that it can draw several cards in a turn cycle, and when you're playing a reactive deck, you're holding up mana, and at instant speed, if someone forces you to use a spell that uses 3 mana to stop something, let's just say whatever that is, let's just imagine that's a figurative spell that exists in colorless. I don't actually, maybe there is one. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And now your mana's kind of awkward, and you didn't really want to have to answer that thing, but you have sort of 4 mana left, and you were hoping that you'd have 7 mana, so you could cast a Urza Eye of Storms when it's out, right? And you now have 4 mana, and it's kind of awkward. Endbringer says, "Don't worry, I've got you. Like, you can just tap me and draw a card, and then I'll untap during the next player's end step, and you can pay 2 and get it again, right? If you only have 3 mana, you could just make something not block. This card kind of ensures that the mana that you hold open doesn't really go to waste. And if you do run out of mana, you can just sort of ping things. It's very sort of multifunctional. The 1 damage to any target is an effective way to sort of pick off utility creatures. I think that's a really sort of useful functionality of this card. And it doesn't really it doesn't hit a range of permanents, but it has a really good sort of flexibility once it's actually in play, and once you've actually made that 6 mana initial investment. It sort of gives you things to do with the mana you hold up, and I've found that generally works quite nicely for me. If my hand's getting a little bit low, I see Endbringer, I think, right, okay, I need to get this down on the end step, so I can tap it straight away in my next turn and just be like 2 mana, get a card back, and then You know, if I can sort of work out if I need to have that as an option on other players' turns. The last one I wanted to mention was Demolition Field, just a really sort of useful piece of disruption built into a land. You can pay 2 so Demolition Field is an untapped colorless land. You know, you just get that functionality added in there on top of a land that taps for the colors you need it to. Straight away, you can sacrifice it to destroy target non-basic land and opponent controls. That land's controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. You may do the same, basically. This is why the deck does run a few basic lands. I think it's sort of like 3 or 4, but it's just so you don't demolition field someone and be like, oh damn, there's no basic lands in the deck. It's the reason the deck does run some basic lands. I think there's Solemn Simulacrum grabs a basic as well. So there's some basics in the deck, and this is the reason why Demolition Field's a good answer for a land. You know, we also looked at Desecrate Reality, which can exile a land, I believe it is. I think it's gone forever. Let me just double check. Exile up to 1 target permanent, yeah. So the deck's its disruption and its removal can get all sorts of permanent types, and that is one of the things I think as a control deck, that's an important aspect. So that's the targeted disruption. It's flexible, it's multifunctional, and I'm now going to move on to thinking about some of the ways that the deck can close games out, how it can win the game essentially. We've been through archetypal card advantage, we've been through archetypal disruption, mass and targeted, and we've been through archetypal ramp. Now we're going to think about how the deck finishes the game, how it closes out a game. So I think probably the most obvious, when just looking at the deck list, the most obvious way that it closes out games are with essentially flashed in Eldrazi, right? I've spoke earlier about functional haste. I think this is one of the most important finishers that Liberator provides, because quite often if you play an Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, right? You're able to exile 2 permanents when you cast it, but to get that sort of that big splashy effect. I mean, this one exiles the top 20 cards of a library, right? But if you're looking at something with like, I don't know, with Annihilator, to get that effect, to get the attack trigger, you kind of have to wait a turn. And if you're able to flash Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger in on the previous player's end step, you get the exile 2 permanents straight away, and then when it's your turn, you're able to attack with the Eldrazi straight away. So that's what you're kind of getting. That's one of the main ways that the deck wins games, is that kind of functional haste of massive Eldrazi creatures. Eldrazi creatures with Annihilator, right? It that betrays is a 12 mana creature, Annihilator 2. Whenever this creature attacks defending player, sacrifices 2 permanents. So that's pretty backbreaking, because they then probably have to block as well, right? Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, put that card onto the battlefield under your control. So you would cast this, and then you flash it in on the previous player's end step, and then you can attack with it straight away. The Annihilator 2 will trigger. They have to sacrifice 2 things, and it has to be a non-token permanent. Sorry, no, it doesn't have to be. It can be any 2 permanents. Sorry, that was wrong. You essentially get the things that they sacrifice. So if they do sacrifice tokens, you don't get anything. So you should probably sacrifice tokens to it that betrays, but you just don't attack the player that has tokens lying around, right? You attack the player that has to sack the things that maybe you want. And because of it, the betrays ability, you get that back straight away. One really cool thing, it's really cool. It's not cool if this is happening to you. It's an interesting interaction that the deck, I'm catching myself here, right? You see that the deck can do, should you really need to obliterate someone, is Abstruse Archaic. which I've already mentioned with regard, I think, to doubling a Sword of Feast and Famine trigger. You can pay 1, tap it to copy target activated or triggered ability from a colorless source. Annihilator is a triggered ability from a colorless source. So you could pay 1, tap Abstruse Archaic to give it that betrays 2 instances of Annihilator, and then an opponent would have to sacrifice 4 things, and you would get all the non-token versions of those things. So that's kind of a really back-breaking thing in general. And it that betrays is, we know this is a good card, right? It's 12 mana. It's obviously really good, but there are little ways that the deck can kind of just get a little bit more juice out of these big splashy cards, like giving them functional haste and copying their triggered abilities, whatever they might be in that case. Another thing I wanted to mention as well that kind of feels like a win con is, and Zuladoc players will know this, right? If you have let's find the Zuladoc man. There we go. So colorless spells you cast from your hand with 7 mana value. Mana value 7 or greater have Cascade, which is awesome and insane. But if you cast it that betrays, you have the possibility of cascading into. Let me just find. A card I was talking about earlier. You have the possibility of cascading into an All is Dust, which everyone just sacrifices all of their things, and that has to be a win con. That kind of has to be the end of the game, right? Whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, so you just steal all of everyone's stuff. Essentially, it feels it's quite mean, right? And it feels kind of Tergrid player coded, right? But that for me is a functional win con, right? That's just such an insurmountable amount of advantage that that could potentially happen. It's kind of rare, and I mentioned Zuladoc players because I've played that deck and that's happened to me, and it was a really wonderful part of my life, if I'm quite honest with you. No one else was having a good time. I was having a great time. But this deck could do that, and I think it's important to note as well that I think having Zuladoc in a Liberator deck as one of the 99 kind of alleviates Zuladoc's main kind of drawback, in that you kind of have to cast it for 6 mana and wait till your next turn until you can play something with 7 mana value or greater, unless you just have like 13 untapped colorless mana kicking around. And for those who don't know, Zuladoc Voidgorger is a 5 and a colorless for a legendary creature Eldrazi. Colorless spells you cast from your hand with mana value 7 or greater have Cascade. I've read it before, but I just wanted to get everyone acquainted. But essentially, you can flash this in on the previous player's end step, because that's what That's what we're trying to do with this deck, right? I feel like that's a bit of a theme that I keep finding myself saying this. But you flash this in on your end step with probably a spare 6 mana. You might have cast a rock on your turn and passed. You flash this in, and then you untap, and you have 6, 7, 8, 9 mana ready to get Zuladoc's ability online straight away. Not let's wait a turn and see if it gets removed, because that is the main kind of issue with this card. If it's a commander, it's really good to be able to flash it out and get that value straight away, because a 7 mana value spell with Cascade is crazy. Cascade is also a triggered ability that you could copy with Abstruse Archaic, should you feel compelled to do so. So other win cons that I've outlined are essentially the 2 Ugin ultimates. Ugin, the Eye of Storms, isn't out yet when I'm filming this video, but it looks really sweet, right? It's really it's got a removal trigger when you cast it. Let's just read through it. It's 7 mana legendary planeswalker. When you cast this spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. So On cast, you get rid of something. It's very flexible removal. It fits all of the sort of caveats I've set up for removal in the deck. You can plus, it enters with 7 loyalty, which is, you know, just Ugin things, right? You can plus 2 it to gain 3 life and draw a card. I love seeing that line, draw a card on these colorless cards. You can 0 it to add 3, which you know you could use that 3 to play like a Worn Power Stone or something like as soon as you play this card, so you can double up on those exile target permanent that's 1 or more color triggers by, you know, 0ing it. And then it's the last ability that's a win con. It's -11, so you'd have to plus it the turn it comes down, plus it again. So it's kind of in three turns. If you really want to get this ability triggered off, you'll have to wait 3 turns to be able to do it. But you know, with a commander that enables flash, there's a possibility that you'd be able to protect it for 3 turn cycles. Although if all of the opponents are just like, well, we need to swing at Ugin, even if you're flashing in blockers and, you know, casting selective obliterations on other people's turns, it might be pretty difficult to keep them, to prevent them from getting some damage through, right? So, you know, if you do get to this ultimate, it reads -11, search your library for any number of colorless non-land cards, exile them, then shuffle. Until the end of turn, you may cast those cards without paying a mana cost. So it's basically just cast your whole deck, which, yeah, you'll just have lands left in your deck. And you just cast as many things. Like that's ridiculous. If that happens, I'd like to hear about it. Obviously, for me, this card isn't out yet. I just thought it looked like the exact kind of card that the exact kind of way that this deck might like to win, and do sort of degenerate things in that sense. But I just thought I'd mention that one because I haven't. It looks very strong. I haven't had a chance to play test it yet. But maybe when this video is out, you will be able to let me know how your Ugin Eye of Storms Ultimate has gone from the future, as it were. So I look forward to hearing those stories, those tall tales from the future, if you like. So they're the sort of like main win cons, I think, of the deck. I think it's worth pointing to where's Glaring Flesh Raker. Yeah, there we go. Glaring Flesh Raker is 2 and 1 colorless for Eldrazi Drone. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, create a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn token with sacrifice this creature, add colorless. Whenever another colorless creature enters the battlefield under your control, Glaring Flesh Raker deals 1 damage to each opponent. So that's just a really good direct damage enabler. This would be the card that probably kills everyone if you were to ultimate Ugin Eye of Storms, right? Because each creature that enters, because you cast them without paying their mana cost. So each one that you cast, you make a spawn. Whenever a colorless creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. Yeah, so you would just need to sort of cast like 20 things, because each cast makes a spawn and all the spawns trigger it as well, so it'll be like double the amount of creatures. Yeah, that's just that's one way of winning a game, right? So yeah, I just thought I'd mention Glaring Flesh Raker because I haven't yet, and it's a really cool card. I actually need to pick one of these up, so I need to stop putting that off. So they're some of the ways that the deck can win the game. A massive Stonecoil Serpent is probably a little bit underpowered way of winning a game, but it is a way of winning the game nonetheless. And the last thing I'm going to talk about today is the Landbase that I've kept sort of referencing all the way through this video, because there's some particular interactions that I want to draw your attention to that have felt really strong during testing, and I want to make that clear to you. A colorless Landbase presents a very particular opportunity to really amp up the functionality of the mana base you set up. We're going to go through the sort of requirements and parameters that I had in mind when putting this mana base together, but I just like to kind of think of, like, in in a figurative sense, let's think of, you know, the perfect teamer mana base, for instance, the perfect blue, red, and green mana base. What does that look like? That has, you know, maybe it has shocks, shock lands, fetch lands, maybe some dual lands, the triomes, right? It has lots of lands that are very good, very expensive, in a lot of demand, because they're very good at getting you access to all the colors of your deck when you need them, right? And that is, you know, a really good mana base of that. Maybe it'll have a couple of utility lands, but because there's more colors there, you need to be playing more lands that get you a greater portion of the colors your deck requires to function. In a colorless deck, because as I mentioned earlier, colorless mana is seen in a design space as a downside, a bit of a limitation of a card. If it only taps for colorless, then it's fine if it comes in untapped, even if it does something else as well, like Demolition Field, for instance. So this Landbase really wants to capitalize on that, and as such, I've included as many untapped colorless utility lands as possible. So like Demolition Field being a good example of this, Arch of Urza being a good example of this. All of these lands enter untapped and give me all of the mana that the deck requires to function. You have to pay a lot more money and run a lot more cards that don't do extra things to achieve that goal in a similar, like 3, even 2 color deck, right? So this colorless mana base is kind of capitalizing on the design space that sees colorless mana as a downside, and it doesn't really matter if it comes in untapped. That said, I've got written down as one of the parameters for the land base is that all lands enter untapped. I've made some exceptions, and there are exceptions for very good lands. So Field of the Dead is one of them, and the other one is Vesuva, which just enters as a copy of another land, but it enters tapped. They're very good lands, and they are the only 2 that enter tapped. So most of the lands in the deck, right, 37 of them, enter untapped, and they all provide all the colors that the deck could possibly need. So that's a capability of the deck that I really wanted to lean into. This is so that the land base can have extra functionality and can kind of work as a bonus toolbox to what the deck can ultimately do. As such, we've got some really important land tutors. Where is Urza's Cave? Urza's Cave being the most recent iteration of this. There it is. So Urza's Cave taps for colorless. It enters untapped, and it enters untapped, and you can pay 3, tap it, and sacrifice Urza's Cave to search your library for a land, put it onto the battlefield, tapped and shuffle. So it gets it any land in your deck straight into play. And you also have Expedition Map here, which does a similar sort of thing, but it puts it in your hand, and then you can play the land you tutored for. They're good tutors for lands that you can often find. In addition to this, to make sure that you can access the lands you want to, they're obviously they're tutors, but I also wanted to point out that I've included several cards in the deck that, like Vesuva, that copy these lands that we're looking to get. Vesuva is a good example of this. Thespian Stage can copy, become another target land, and there is also Mirage Mirror, which is just there. That's 3 mana. You can pay 2 to make it a copy of target artifact, creature, enchantment, or land. So that's why I've still got Mirage Mirror in here in case I need it to be a copy of one of the many lands that the deck includes that has extra functionality. It can become a copy of Field of the Dead, for instance, which can just really get quite out of hand quite quickly. So it's toolboxy because there's lots of ways to copy lands. There's lots of ways. There are ways to tutor for specific lands, and you're just going to sort of encounter some lands as you play the game and as you draw cards anyway. So what this leads to essentially is kind of what we have in terms of, if I just turn the tags back on, what we had with the tags, where we have loads of overlap, which means we can significantly exceed like 35 ramp, 17 card advantage, right? We can significantly exceed the command zone deck building template without really making that many sort of compromises, because a lot of the land slots are also being card selection. They're also being targeted disruption. So we can get some I was really excited to see exactly what those numbers would be once I'd finished putting this deck together. And yeah, I was particularly surprised that the ramp was as high as 35. Maybe that's too high. Maybe it means that I have too much redundancy in that slot. But, you know, this deck plays a lot of expensive spells, and it seems to get to a good amount of mana fairly consistently in testing. So maybe that's just a benefit of having this really versatile toolboxy land in play. So one of the effects of having this many utility lands can be seen when we think about the potentiality for synergies between cards. So let's go back to the Temur mana base we considered before. Let's just say it's an Animar deck or something, right? And if we follow the command zone template, we get that there's going to be 38 lands in that deck. So in terms of non-lands, there is probably about 62 cards that can possibly have synergies with each other, right? That's just how it is with deck building with, let's say, inverted commas, a normal mana base. When you have a colorless mana base, and I would say, there's like 4 basics in this deck for Demolition Field and Solemn Simulacrum. So let's just say figuratively, there are 10 basics in the deck. That means that the rest of those utility cards, and so let's say there are 61 non-land cards in this deck, right? If you were to then add on the amount of extra utility there is in that land base, you would be looking at about 90 cards that could potentially have synergies with other cards. So my point being here with this this toolboxy kind of mana base is when thinking about the amount of cards that can possibly synergize between each other, that number goes from about 62, maybe a bit more if that deck is able to play some utility lands itself, the Temur deck, for instance, to probably higher than 90, right? 90 different cards that can potentially have synergies with each other. Now, I want to caveat this by acknowledging the fact that utility lands aren't really whole cards, right? Like, you know, the effect, if you had let's just find one, like Arch of Araska is a good example, right? It's 5 mana, and to tap it to draw a card, activate only if you have the City's Blessing, right? It's not a good rate. It's not really a card that we would want to play. But in some scenarios, it is an effective way of getting a bit more card advantage, and it is doing more things than just a forest would be, for instance. So there is a caveat that, yeah, okay, there's 90 cards that can potentially have synergy with other cards in the deck, and of the ones of those that are utility lands are potentially like an Arch of Araska effect, like kind of half a card, really. But even if we then kind of count each utility land as half a card, we're still getting way more synergy. What would that be? And just sort of do a general ballpark figure. Say we take 20 off that and just say like 75. That's still more than 10, between 10 and 15 extra slots that can potentially have synergy within the deck. Like, you know, for instance, Field of the Dead is a very relevant effect. When a land enters, you make a zombie. Like, that's an interesting, that effect's worth a card. So if we then copy that with like an Abstruse Archaic or something, that's an interaction between Abstruse Archaic and a land in Field of the Dead that maybe wouldn't be there in other decks. If Field of the Dead was just a forest, that extra functionality of Abstruse Archaic wouldn't be a thing. So that's one of the things that I've found that this land base gives. It gives the extra potentialities for synergy between a greater range of cards, even if some of those cards are suboptimal, like Arch of Orazca. It gives that potential for synergy more so than if we didn't have a colorless deck. And the deck wants to lean into that design space. That's something that's really important. So I think it's also worth mentioning some of the cool interactions that this one of the ones that I found that I think it's worth mentioning some of the cool interactions that the deck is able to provide. One that I think is worth mentioning is Planar Nexus, which reads, Planar Nexus is every non-basic land type. So non-basic land types are cave, desert, gate, lair, locust, mine, power plant, sphere, tower, and Urzas. Right? So if you have, Urza's Tower out, and you also have Planar Nexus in play, Planar Nexus is Urza's, it's a tower, it's a power plant, and it's a mine. So it turns Urza's Tower on. So if you have an opening hand and you have Urza's Tower and Planar Nexus, you best believe you're keeping that hand, right? You essentially this comes in turn 2 as a land that taps for 3 colorless mana. That Planar Nexus I think is one of my favorite cards in the deck. It's one of the best cards in the deck, and it can do other things as well, right? If it counts as an Urza's, it means that if you play out Urza's Workshop, it's 1 extra Urza's land. And Urza's Workshop, I've seen in testing this tap for sort of 4 or 5 mana certain times, because you could have Urza's Factory, you could have Urza's Tower. Urza's Workshop counts itself, so that's 3. You might have a Vesuva or a Thespian Stage copying the Workshop, and then that really goes insane because you have 2 instances of the Workshop that both tap for 5, right? There's some really, really kind of interesting things that this mana base can do, and there's some really interesting things this mana base does, and I think that it's not just like utility stuff like taking out someone's land with Demolition Field or making tokens with Field of the Dead. It can really ramp quite aggressively. Eugen's Labyrinth, if you can exile a colorless card with mana value 7 or greater from your hand, you've got access to a land that taps for 2. So that's just some really, really good functionality. Urza's Saga can make constructs. It can sort of grab your Soul Ring, it can grab your Skull Clamp. Should you have, a Fountain Port to make fish. Where's Fountain Port gone? To make some fish to sacrifice to the Skull Camp, right? So there's just a really good amount of functionality here. Similarly, Inventor's Fair, right? If you at the beginning of your upkeep, if you gain 3 or more artifacts, this deck does that quite well. It plays a lot of artifacts. You gain 1 life, so a bit of incidental life gain. It also enters untapped and gives you colorless mana that you need. And you generally find in this deck that you're sacrificing this to grab a copy of the One Ring, right? To get that extra card advantage, to get your game plan online, and to be able to be reactive to everyone else's plan. So that's kind of what the mana base is doing here. There are probably some interactions that I've missed that are pretty cool. Tomb of the Spirit Dragon can be a really good life gain spell. That's helped me out in a tight spot before. Sanctum of Ugin can grab a colorless spell with mana value 7 or greater, which is great if you're trying to sort of activate Zuludok triggers. There's a lot to go through. Maybe it needs a separate video. If I've missed any cool interactions, have a look through. Let me know, right? Because I've played this deck quite a few times. I've tested it quite a few times, and these are the things that I've found really interesting and engaging about the deck. And I'd love to hear from you guys a little bit more about, some options you might include. I know, for instance, that I have tended towards Kozilek or variants of Kozilek, right, in my Eldrazi selection. This is because these I mainly have COLOURLESS. COLOURLESS my favorite Eldrazi. COLOURLESS is the Eldrazi that kind of draws you cards. So you know that's why I've gone for the sort of card advantage COLOURLESS. The other one's really expensive, so maybe I need to bite the bullet and get a copy or wait for it to come down or whatever. But that's why I've sort of made these kind of Eldrazi choices. I think it's an interesting decision. I've gone, like I said, I've gone for the card advantage ones because I want this deck to be reactive and adaptive. But yeah, you might say that there's you know, the new Ulamog that exiles half of someone's library, right, and has ungodly amounts of Annihilator on it. That might be a more optimal option. And you know, I hear it. I want a deck with more COLOURLESS. I think he's a cool man. He's probably a man. He's not a man. He's definitely not a man, but he draws cards, and I like him, so he's in the deck. And yeah, if you have any other thoughts about anything I've said, any thoughts about the Landbase, I'm really getting quite preoccupied with that idea. I might experiment with it a little more, maybe put more lands in potentially. I don't know what would that add to the consistency of it. I feel like there's a lot of ramp there anyway. So yeah, this is kind of where the deck's at. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And yeah, I'm going to wrap this video up here. You know, if you're not subscribed and you would like to subscribe, please do so. You can turn on notifications and all that good stuff. But yeah, I have been Will. I've been going through my Liberator Urza's Battle Thopter deck tech, and I'm keen to hear what you think. And if you've got this far, thank you very much. I appreciate you. I appreciate your attention, and I hope you have a really good day. Take care.